contemporary social theories about self and community identity that are based on this. So in this part of the lecture, we're going to be answering the question, but how does that even work? So we've reviewed histories of ideas about identity that emerged from the Enlightenment, that gave us the idea of the agentic, coherent, self-authoring, rational individual. We thought about how this led to the Romantic period, where maybe the idea of the individual not being quite so rational emerged, where we privileged feelings and sentiments again. That perhaps is a precursor to Freud, who began to think more about the irrational, repressed structures of desires and fantasies and other forces and structures that control who we are and how we think, to Marx, who began to think about how structures of economic relations shape our identities, to Tonias, who then theorized different economic orders of social relations that shape us, not just ones to do with modern capitalism that he called Gesellschaft, but also Gemeinschaft, how these traditional social ties, perhaps stronger social ties, continue to prevail into modern society. You might even want to, as I've been intimating in the previous part of the lecture, think about how theorists such as Weber then have influenced people like Tonias's ideas about self and community identity, and go back to his notions of power, where he thought about Marx being limited in his theories of economic relations for not also thinking about the influence of cultural ideas. Here we can think about Weber and how his ideas of power can be transferred to cultural ideals about self and community identity, where tradition or charisma perhaps drive identity, or legal, bureaucratic, institutionalized norms and knowledges perhaps drive ideas about identity. And that also takes us to Foucault, where we might think about sexual norms, psychological norms, or civil norms of civil society in institutions and disciplines. That's what they had to say. But then it's like, well, what is the microphysics, to use the term of Foucault, of how this all works? How does this all work? And that's where social theory begins to give us more theory to kind of propose ideas that sometimes seem way out there, but sometimes not, about how some of this might actually work. So first of all, let's start with Jacques Lacan. Jacques Lacan took Freud's idea about being largely shaped by unconscious, preconscious, or subconscious forces and started to develop it a little bit further. He was like, probably people aren't driven by penis envy or wanting to sleep with their mother. A lot of these ideas had been discounted by this time. But he agreed with Freud that we don't generally know exactly who we are. And he was very interested in developmental psychology. How do we form ideas about ourselves? And he also began to think about the role of language, like a lot of post-structuralist thinkers did begin to think in this era. And that's why we're going to be thinking about narrative and communication next week, and why you also had a reading for your blog reading this week on the role of narrative and language in the formation of subjectivity. Now, he said, we actually don't know who we are until we can say who we are. And unlike the blog reading that you had this week that basically tells us that narrative is what makes sense of our lives and gives us our own truths about ourselves that are coherent, he said, what we say about ourselves is always based on false recognition. Now, unlike Freud, then, he's saying it's not sex that makes us, but language that makes us. And he was very interested in the developmental phase the psychologists call the mirror stage, a period when we can identify and apprehend our bodies in the mirror and point to ourselves and say, that is me, or that is Victoria, or that is Brooke, or that is Haley, or that is Roger, or whatever your name is. Now, he said, we don't actually know when we're born where our bodies begin and end. We're just big blobs. We often feel like we are still appendages of our mother because we are so needy and dependent on her. And in a mother's womb, there is no separation between self and other. It's one being. And the first language, according to Lacan, is the crying for the mother's breast milk, in which a baby begins to assert some sort of control on the other. And at first, that control, that crying for and realizing crying brings something to self, is seeing, in Lacan's theories, the mother as just an appendage of the self, a part of the self, as if it's your arm or your leg that you're learning how to control at the same time. But it's also, he said, the beginning of this learning how there is a relationship between articulation and language and control and self and other. And he said a fundamental thing happens at the mirror stage when we recognize an image of ourself in the mirror as ourselves, that he says is also based on a fundamental split between self and other, not just a split between me and my mother's body as an infant, but also a split between me, who I am in my inner self, feeling and sensing things, and my recognition of the image of myself. And he said that recognition of the image of yourself is almost the same as recognizing yourself as an other. And he said that's fundamental to the development of language, where we substitute symbols and images for reality. And fundamentally, he says that's what language is. And to call yourself by your own name and to begin to command the world in a language, he said, is founded on this kind of split self, this beginning to be formed within a world of symbols and languages. And he said, from then on, we are made in and through language. We can't conceive of our place in the world without it. However, symbols, he says, always inadequately represent our experience and ourselves. We always mistake the image for reality, and it can inadequately capture our subconscious desires. So you can see how he's building on this idea of the subconscious, but he's beginning to think about how we move from pre-conscious to subconscious to conscious articulating beings, and how that forms ideas about ourselves. Now, like Lacan, Franz Fanon was a theorist who is also important because he thought about the relationship of self-identity to language. But he was important because he took Lacan's ideas and he applied them to race. So for me, as a post-colonial theorist, his ideas have been very important. His first book, Black Skins, White Masks, in 1952, you can see has the essence of his idea, that people who look Black actually take on white personas. And he said that they do that in a way that shows how they're shaped by their education. Now, he was fundamentally altered by his experience of growing up in the West Indies and then getting involved in the fight for independence in Algiers and being educated in Paris as a psychoanalyst in the 50s. And this is not too long after Freud, right, and Lacan. And he is, like Lacan, kind of going, oh, how does this all work? But he experienced racism for the first time in Paris. And he began to feel like he was an imposter and did not really adequately belong in the academy. And he began to ask himself the question about why is it that a Black man internalizes his own subordination. He felt that everywhere he saw Black migrants in Britain in the 1950s, they all kind of internalized the social British rules that were very class-oriented at that time, in which white men, and particular posh ways of talking, if you were a white man and aristocratic, determined the kind of person who you wished to be and were taught to want to be. And he wanted to know, why is it that he himself and others that he identified with and was in community with from the Black community in London seemed to accept these ideas that they are simply at the bottom of the pecking order. And so he took Lacan's ideas and said, well, we are made through our education, through language, through the stories that we read, through ways of talking and knowing and symbol systems, through narratives, and we'll learn this more next week, which continually stress this principle that the white man is at the top of the hierarchy and that the white man's ways of seeing are the right ones. Now, you have to realize this is back in the day when people would talk about European knowledge as civilization and everywhere else was not civilized. It was a very Eurocentric world that Franz Fanon was coming of age in and trying to make sense of. And so he believed that through language and education, culture naturalizes relations of inequality through education, in which race also becomes a form of false consciousness. Now, Louis Althusser was similarly interested in how language perhaps makes us the kind of beings that we think that we are, but he was more interested in Marx's ideas about class than he was, for instance, like Lacan, interested in ideas about personal identity. And he also took Foucault's ideas about institutions a bit further, and he thought about how they work at an individual level. And his big idea they came up with in 1970 was his idea of interpolation, also touched upon in the article this week, otherwise known as hailing. And he says people are hailed into pre-constituted, ideologically driven language structures and discourses. Hailing, he says, is a mechanism by which the human subject is constituted by pre-given power structures which position the person in relation to the state. Now, what does that all mean? So basically, remembering back to Foucault, he's saying We're no longer in a world where, at least in most countries in the West, you're not going to witness public executions. We don't live under the threat of the Taliban. We do not live under the threat that if we do something wrong, we will be hung, beheaded, strung up, suffer public punishment or execution. We believe that we are subject to a rule of law, and for the most part, we live in a docile, peaceful society, to use Foucault's words. But he said the way that this works is there's two forms of state power, and one is what he called repressive state apparatus. So that would be the police and the law, for example. And it doesn't often come into your life unless you actually do something wrong. And then there's ideological state institutions, and these are the ones that Foucault talked about. For instance, psychiatry, which governs norms about mental wellness and illness, or the federal government, which governs ideas about citizenship. We've just recently gone through a census which gathered information about, religious beliefs, for example, or gender and sexuality. And a lot of people in the media noted that they were really unhappy with the questions that were asked in the census, that they weren't up to contemporary times and didn't reflect contemporary categories of identity. Another form of ideological state apparatus that Althusser identified was the church, which governed notions of morality, and school, which governed notions of knowledge. And so he said it's no longer so much the repressive state apparatus as it is the ideological state apparatus that hails us into being. But it still works in the same way that a policeman would hail you. So while a policeman might recognize you on the street and say, "Hey, you," and you know that it's you that they're calling, and you turn around, and you are now either an innocent or suspect citizen, and you may be incarcerated or you may be questioned, you are falling into their rules. And that might be an instance where it's bodily experienced, it plays out on the street. But he's saying most of this stuff plays out on the level of ideology, where ideologically norms and unspoken rules about knowledge and categories of knowledge hail us, and we find our way in language, in discourse, being hailed by these ideas. Now, Judith Butler also says we're hailed by language and institutional knowledges and norms, but she took these ideas and instead of thinking so much about class that might hail us or disciplinary knowledge that might hail us, she thought about gender. And she said that gender is not necessarily biologically determined, but she said we are also hailed into accepted norms about gendered behavior. They are not culturally universal. In the Middle East, for example, it is completely acceptable and encouraged for men, for example, to hold hands while they're walking down the street. So ideas about gender, we do know, differ from culture to culture. Just these very kind of essential ideas give us the sense that it's therefore not biologically essential. It differs from culture to culture. So she says, how do we acquire what we learn somehow subconsciously as the rules of our gender? And she says we do this by iterative performance, like taking on a particular way of dressing day after day after day, or demonstrating a particular kind of, carriage of our posture, or, wearing makeup or not. And she says, of course, this isn't the same as being fake. It's just a way of iterative behavior, controlling or determining our subjectivity. We perform our subjectivity according to codes that we think will be recognized. Now, it's interesting to think about how this is challenging for some people, for people who are on the spectrum, for example, where perhaps nonverbal codes of behavior are not always as straightforward as they may seem to other people. Or you might think about people who counterculturally purposely challenge these norms and defy wanting to live according to accepted norms and standards, or who feel, for instance, that they're unable to. And so I'll leave that there, and we can watch a video on that as well at the end of this part of this lecture. So there's some key social theorists. In the next part of the lecture, I'm going to be starting to think about how we might use these as tools to begin to theorize subjectivity and identity on the internet, whether within self or community.